Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today as co-host is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, nice to see you here today.
It's good to have you back in Texas, sir.
Oh, it's good to be back. I'm glad you kept things going. I better be careful or I'll get fired if I leave and miss too often. But we have a very special guest today, and many of our viewers already know him because he was so kind as to come to our conference in Alexandria. He was fantastic. We have to be careful or he will be stealing our show, but we're really pleased that he's with us. That's Thomas Massie, 4th District in Kentucky. Thomas, great to have you with us today.
Well, great to be with you, Ron, and I've got one of the best senators in the world in Kentucky. I'm speaking of your son. It's great to have him for a senator.
Well, you did a lot to help him in campaigning, but the big thing is you promote the cause of liberty, and that's what really counts, and that's why both Rand and myself were early supporters for you when you first ran for Congress. But we're just delighted to see your work in Congress today, and I think you're carrying the torch quite well. I would like you to start off with maybe giving us a little bit of an update. You gave us a bit of an update when you were at our convention, but there's been a few new things dealing with foreign policy in the Congress. Could you give us a couple hints on some of the votes you've had to cast, and did you have any difficult votes to cast?
Sure. There were 3 votes on foreign policy, which I know is in your monetary policy and foreign policy are sort of in your wheelhouse. And I'd like to think we voted how you would have voted, several of us in the Liberty Caucus, which is still alive and well. The first vote I want to tell you about was here, the warmongers were just dead set on rattling sabers at Russia. And so they wanted to issue some rebuke to Russia over Georgia. And so, there was some discussion. The bill was called, honoring the territorial integrity of Georgia or something like that. And I think some of the congressmen thought if we gave that to Georgia, South Carolina would want it next. But we reminded them that we're talking about foreign policy here. Anyways, so there were only 6 votes against that, against rattling our sabers at Russia. And myself, Justin Amash, Walter Jones, and Jimmy Duncan were 4 of the reliable votes. We also had Lamar Smith from your state in Texas and Dana Rohrabacher. That was one of our foreign policy votes. We had another vote, which they're always dead set on keeping everybody in Gitmo at Gitmo. And my position is much like Senator Paul's position, which is give them some kind of tribunal. You can't keep somebody indefinitely detained without charging them for something. And so give them a tribunal, some kind of trial, and then either let them go or convict them. But right now they're in this state where we're just going to be taking care of them forever, yet, keeping them in prison without a trial. So we had a vote where people in Congress wanted, assert their neoconism. And so they voted to make sure nobody gets out of Gitmo. Whether they're innocent or not, they're all going to stay in Gitmo. And so there were 4 of us that voted against that on the Republican side. There were some Democrats that voted, with us. But again, Jimmy Duncan, Walter Jones, Justin Amash, and myself. And finally, a vote that happened just last week. They wanted to give more foreign aid to Israel, particularly military aid. And, I've polled this issue in my district, and most of my constituents are not in favor of more foreign aid to any country. So again, you had 4 of us, Walter Jones, you're seeing a pattern here, Walter Jones, Jimmy Duncan, Justin Amash, and myself, who voted against sending more foreign aid over there.
Thomas, I wanted to bring up a subject along those lines that remind me about a vote you took. I believe you voted all by yourself. And you voted against subsidies for green energy to Israel, and you were the only one that voted against it. Do you recall if you got any grief from that? Some people are against subsidies, but they will still be willing to vote for that. Do you recall if you got any grief at all?
Oh, yeah, I got a lot of grief for that. Those are sort of, for me, they're gut-wrenching votes. For you, I think they got easy after a while, but I was the only no on that. And it had a wonderful title. That's the problem with these bills. You know, they run the articles back home to say, you voted against a bill calling Israel our best ally, you know, bill. Well, the bill had green energy subsidies. It called for grants for green energy subsidies. So you had conservatives who wouldn't even vote for that stuff here in the United States, but they're happy to give it in the form of foreign aid overseas. Yet because the name of the bill mentioned Israel, they were afraid to vote no, and I was the only no on that one.
Daniel?
Well, I want to thank you for joining us, Representative Massie. I also want to thank you again for speaking at the Ron Paul Institute's conference on the 10th of this month. It was such a great speech. And I want to thank you for joining our Board of Advisors. We're so happy to have you. It's a great thrill. So thanks very much for that. It's funny you've taken a couple of tough votes where you're the only no vote. And I remember the times back on the Hill when Dr. Paul did that. And it was always kind of funny because my colleague at the time, Jeff Deist, was the press secretary at the time. And inevitably, if he was the one no vote, the press would call like crazy. Why did you vote against it? Why did you vote against it? And Jeff always said, why don't you call the other guys and see why they voted for it?
That's a better question.
But if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind backing up a bit talk a little bit more about you, and I'm interested, and I think a lot of our viewers would be interested in your transition to embracing libertarian principles, how you got to start being attracted to these. You have such an illustrious career. You've got a degree from MIT. You're a successful entrepreneur. You built a multi-million-dollar business. You built a house with your own hands in Kentucky where you live off the grid. So how did you start getting interested in these principles? And if you don't mind telling us, what was the transition from this wonderful life in Kentucky to the life in Washington like?
Well, I call the life in Kentucky, that's the Shire. And I'm, John McCain called us all hobbits, I think. But so the Shire is Kentucky and Mordor is Washington, D.C. So every Monday I put on my precious and come to Washington, D.C. And it really is like Mordor. It's hard to say why any of us get into politics, but I can tell you when I figured out that the two parties, there was something wrong, that neither of the two parties represented me predictably or accurately, or even the intention of the people. And that was in 1993. There was an event that happened in Texas with the Branch Davidians. And what I saw on TV, they kept the media away from that. There was a standoff between the government and the Branch Davidians. Now, what's funny is, he was accused of polygamy, and now they've decided to sort of more or less legalize a redefinition of marriage. But the Republicans were upset at the Branch Davidians because they said maybe they were doing drugs or maybe they had illicit sexual relations, right? But the Democrats were mad at the Branch Davidians because they were religious and they liked guns, right? So, and what I saw on TV disturbed me is some people were rooting for the defeat of these Americans who were bothering nobody. Yet the government, once they sort of got into this standoff with the Branch Davidians, it was clear there was never going to be a good way out for them. The heavy boot of government was going to come down on these folks. And it's just sad. It's really sad to me what the eventual outcome was there. And I thought there's got to be a better way than to roll in and be so heavy-handed on people that are just minding their own business.
Okay. I know, Thomas, that you've done some work on the concern about NSA and surveillance. Why don't you give us an update on what's happening in Congress, if anything good, and of course in context of what's going on with the invasion of our privacy. I know systematically it's being attacked constantly, but we're delighted that you're at least involved in that and trying to slow it up a bit.
Yeah, well, I have some good news to report on this front. That is, this summer they tried to sneak through on a voice vote a suspension bill, which means there's no debate and it hasn't gone through the committee and it's not been marked up. But they brought a bill straight to the floor that would have expanded the Patriot Act. There's a clause in the Patriot Act that says that banks can send your financial information, regardless of the dollar amount. They could send it straight to the government if they suspect you of terrorism or money laundering. Well, what they sought to do was to take out the words terrorism and money laundering and replace it with any crime. So literally, if the bank suspected you of anything without a warrant, without the government requesting it, they could just stream your financial information to the government. And they brought this vote up. They tried to pass it by a voice vote. I got to give kudos to my friend Justin Amash, who went to the floor and demanded a recorded vote. And when we got the recorded vote, we were able to get enough people to respond to their congressman in just a few hours that the recorded vote failed. And so the Patriot Act was not expanded this summer. It could have easily happened were it not for Justin Amash and myself and a few others there.
Thomas, has the Congress taken any position or made any statement about Snowden and what they would like to see happen there?
You know, that's interesting you asked that question. I just rushed over from a classified setting where Justin Amash and I were together reading the classified report that Congress has prepared on Snowden. So they prepared this report in anticipation of the release of that movie. But the problem is so much of that is classified that they can't release. They're basically trying, in the report, I can't tell you what's in the report or any of the classified stuff, but they're basically trying to portray this picture of somebody who was a complainer and inept and that wasn't suitable for the job or whatever. But the reality is they kept promoting him and moving him forward. And the report, there's a lot of stuff to be suspect of in the report. I think they should publish it. Publish the report, the classified report, if it's that damaging to Snowden, and then let him respond. But the reality is this, Ron, they changed the Patriot Act last year because of the Snowden revelation. And the fact that they changed something they were doing is an admission that he revealed something that wasn't right. And I mean, that's at the end of the day, if we met in Congress and passed something and the president signed a bill, that's an admission that he did a service. Whether he did damage or not, he did a service to this country by revealing the way that our Constitution was being abused.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great point, Mr. Massie. And it's also shows that public opinion being changed by things like the revelations from Snowden is very powerful, and it affects politicians. And I remember while you were speaking at the conference, you talked about how when the march up to the Syrian war, the war drums were beating, and all of a sudden Capitol Hill started lighting up with phone calls, people calling their members saying, "We don't want war." And I remember working for Dr. Paul, how a few phone calls will get your attention. And I was wondering if you might share with us how it works in your office, because I don't think people realize how much effect they can have on Washington.
You can have tremendous effect. I mean, that's the other good news I think we need to share with as many people as possible. Congress critters do respond to public pressure. The problem is it's usually the lobbyists, the military-industrial complex that has their attention once they're inside the Beltway. But you can break through that membrane with a phone call. I don't recommend writing letters. They just pile up. They're answered with form letters. But when you make a phone call, a live person on my staff has to answer that phone call. And I typically only get 5 to 7 phone calls a day out of 750,000 constituents. So on the Syrian issue in 2013, I started getting 100 phone calls a day for like 7 or 10 days in a row. And this was, you remember, President Obama said, "Oh, Assad's crossed the red line, and we need to go to war. We need to go to war now, and I want Congress to approve it." And Speaker Boehner said, "Oh, yeah, we'll tee this up for you." And Nancy Pelosi said, "We'll tee this up for you." But the reality is the phone calls started coming in. And when you get 700 phone calls against going to war and 1 for going to war, it's pretty clear you better start listening to your constituents. And I even went to members of Congress on the floor, like a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is traditionally against war. And I said, "Are you really going to vote for war if this comes to the floor?" And he said, I'm not going to out him because he's a friend. And he said, "There's no way I'm voting to go to war in Syria. I'm trying to be nice to my president, okay? And so I'm not going to say anything publicly, but if this comes to a vote, there's no way I'm voting for it." So what did they do? They pulled the bill from the floor. We never voted to go to war in Syria. It never happened. And it was solely because of the people that were making phone calls that we didn't have boots on the ground in 2013 to now. Now, there's a secret, funding of weapons and whatnot that's going there with dubious effect that, Obama sought to entertain through a classified budget, which Snowden has disclosed, right? And the Washington Post has reported on. But ultimately, those phone calls, I would say, saved thousands of American lives.
I think that's a great story, and it means that if the people wake up, they can have an effect. But we're dealing with, a powerful force when it comes to war propaganda, and it'll be back again constantly. There'll be something up soon, and who knows what happens when you're in a break and this sort of thing. But I did want to shift a little bit because I know you've had an interest in the drug war, the idiocy of that war, and of course, I think we've made inroads on that, but you in particular have nibbled away on the fallacies dealing with industrial hemp. How does that stand right now?
Well, I got an amendment in 2013 on the Farm Bill that allowed industrial hemp to be grown in any state that made it legal. And this is rope, not dope. As you pointed out to me when I came into Congress, Ron, you could smoke a hemp joint the size of a telephone pole and it still wouldn't do anything for you. Maybe it'd give you a headache. I remember you telling me that on the floor of the House. So anyways, I picked up your bill, and it was important to Kentucky, and I pushed it, and we got an amendment on the Farm Bill. There's 1,000 acres of hemp growing in Kentucky today, and there's nobody passed out in the fields. There's nobody sneaking in, growing dope in the middle of it. Not a single person has gotten hurt from this, and what we've proven is not only is it not dangerous, but it grows great in Kentucky. And so the next step is to completely legalize it for industrial purposes. And we keep having votes on that every year, and it passes as an amendment to bills, but those bills never pass. I think if I could get your original industrial hemp bill to the floor, and by the way, the chairman of the committee now is talking to us about this. He's interested because he's from Virginia, and his farmers are growing it. And he's been to a hemp field now, so there's pictures of the chairman with industrial hemp all around him. And so he's actually supporting it now. I think if we get this to the floor, it's going to pass by a veto-proof majority. So that's going to be great because it's legal in every industrialized country in the world except for the United States, where only thanks to the Farm Bill can you grow it for research purposes. Well, so that's some great news.
That's good progress.
Meanwhile, speaking of the war on drugs, we had a hearing in the Oversight Committee where the Inspector General for Afghanistan and even the Deputy Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense for the region that includes Afghanistan, testified that we've spent $8 billion trying to eradicate poppy production, which is what opium and heroin ultimately come from. We spent $8 billion in Afghanistan, and I asked them both what the result was, and the result was they've doubled production. You only get 5 minutes in a hearing. So I talked to the Inspector General later, and I was like, could you just spray Roundup on that stuff? I mean, wouldn't that kill it? And he said, yeah. He said it would devastate it. And so I said, well, why aren't we doing that? And he said it would be far too effective. Like, in other words, it would actually work, and we're not really trying to eradicate the production over there because there's a tenuous relationship between the government we're propping up and the Taliban. And you would tick off the Taliban, you would disrupt the situation over there. So even though we're spending the money, we're not trying to do anything. So I offered an amendment this summer on the DoD appropriations bill to just quit wasting money in Afghanistan saying we're trying to eradicate poppy when we're not. And I thought I might get 3 or 4 votes, maybe 20. I got 63 votes. Now, It took 218 to pass, but that's pretty good news when 63 people realize this is just a waste of money.
Progress. Daniel, you have anything else?
Well, on the similar note, you've done a lot with getting the U.S. out of the UN. You've done a lot of work that Dr. Paul used to do on the UN.
Yeah.
And it's important an issue when it comes to U.S. sovereignty. But one of the things that Dr. Paul noticed toward the later part of his terms there is that the neocons who had initially agreed with him about the UN, they fell in love with it. And it's because they started being able to control it. And now they love the UN because they feel like it's an extra tool in the toolbox of U.S. interventionist foreign policy.
Well, they feel like it's a tool. They also, the president would like to think it's a tool for getting his policies passed domestically. and imposed on us that he can't get through Congress, right?
Yeah.
He would like more gun control. And so he feels like if he pushes, and Senator Kerry or Secretary Kerry has, already signed off on this. They feel like if they can get the UN to adopt it, then they can use the force of the UN to exert that over our sovereignty. And so, yeah, I've offered the same bill that Ron Paul offered to get us out of the UN. Now, I've called it a Mexit, to take a cue on the Brexit vote. And people realize it's the same sort of thing. I mean, it's not an exact analog, but the British, they were giving some of their sovereignty to a bigger organization. And we've done the same thing to a different degree at the UN. So I've offered the Mexit bill. I'm actually a co-sponsor of that. There's another congressman that offered it. But it's picking up steam. I mean, people are starting to wake up, particularly when they're pushing gun control and some of this green energy policy and things like that. People don't want to give up our sovereignty. Another problem is, and I know you spoke about this, is the World Trade Organization. Last year in the omnibus, we just removed our country of origin labeling from beef and pork because the World Trade Organization told us to. And that's pretty scary. Regardless of how you feel about that issue, whether we should have to label stuff from other countries, I think it's dangerous when other countries tell us what we can and can't label on our own food.
Yeah, there you go. We have to finish up here shortly, but I do want to ask you one more brief question, and that is, have you received any punishment from the leadership? I know when I was leaving Congress, several of our allies were actually punished and taken off the committee. Is that going on now, or is that all history?
I was a subcommittee chair, and I don't want to talk about which committee and say which chairman it was, because I still like the chairman. But after I voted against Boehner and took some of these brave votes, they came to me and said, we're not going to kick you off the committee. We're going to dissolve the committee, and somebody else is going to be chair of the other committee we're merging it with. So it was very creative.
Exactly.
We had to reprint our stationery. We didn't issue new press releases that they had dissolved my subcommittee. But I'm convinced if you want to get rid of some of these useless subcommittees, just make me chairman, and then they'll shortly dissolve the subcommittee. They later, 2 years later, came to me and said, we'd like to offer you another subcommittee chairmanship on the committee we merged yours with. And I said, wait, I've seen this movie before. And by the way, in 4 weeks, I'm voting against John Boehner, and you're going to do the same thing to me that you did 2 years ago. So go give somebody else that position, and we'll save you and me the embarrassment of being removed from that position, because they're usually decorative anyway.
Right.
I mean, it's just something to do a press release on, and the subcommittee chairs are told what to do by the chairman, and for the most part, the chairman are told what to do by the speaker. Mm-hmm. So if there were anybody like me that were truly independent to become a chairman, it would be a miracle.
Right. Thomas, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. This is a great program, and I hope we can get you back on another day.
I'll come back anytime you want, and thanks for leaving us with a great legacy here, Dr. Paul.
Thank you. And I want to thank our audience today for joining us here at Liberty Report. I think it's been a great interview, and there are several like that. I think the Congress probably is in better shape now than it was 4 years ago as I was leaving. I think the Liberty movement is alive and well, and Thomas Massie has had a lot to do with that. And please come back to the Liberty Report soon.